Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Emily, and I will never forget this day. It was probably the best day of my life. It was a Saturday in June. The sun was shining on the little church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, where I was to marry Thomas, the man I had loved for 5 years. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut roses, and soft music came from the open doors of the church. I stood in a small back room. I nervously adjusted my veil in front of a full-length mirror. My best friend, Sophie, was helping me smooth out the creases in my dress. My heart was racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. I had waited for this moment for so long, and now that it was here, I was overwhelmed with emotion. "You look beautiful, Emily," Sophie told me. She put her hands on my shoulders. "Thomas will be dazzled." I smiled at him in the mirror. I was grateful for his reassuring presence. We had known each other since high school, and she had been by my side through every important in my life. Today was no exception. Suddenly we heard a commotion coming from the entrance of the church. Voices were getting louder and louder. Sophie and I exchanged worried glances. "What's going on?" I whispered, feeling my stomach sink. Sophie opened the door a crack to have a look. "I don't know," she said, looking confused. "There is a crowd at the entrance." My father, who was supposed to lead me to the altar, appeared at the door, his face pale. "Emily, my darling," he said quietly, "there is a problem." Before I could ask what it was, the door burst open and Martin appeared. Thomas's mother burst into the room. His face was red with rage. His eyes were flashing. "You," she shouted, pointing at me. "How dare you?" I stepped back, shocked at the violence in his tone. "Madame Leblanc," I stammered. "What's going on here?" "Don't play innocent with me," she shouted. "You stole my emerald ring, the one my grandmother left me." Silence fell over the small room. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. My heart began to beat even faster, this time out of fear and confusion. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely audible. "I have never seen your ring, Madame Leblanc." But Martin wouldn't listen. She continued to accuse me. Her voice carried through the church. I could hear the murmurs of the guests, their worried whispers. Thomas appeared at the door, his face grave. His eyes moved from his mother to me. Disbelief was written all over his face. "Emily," he said in a tense voice, "is this true?" I felt my heart break as I heard the doubt in his voice. How could he think I was capable of such a thing? "Thomas," I said with tears in my eyes, "I swear I didn't do anything. I never saw the ring." But the damage was done. Doubt had set in, and I could see it in Thomas's eyes, and those of our guests who had gathered at the door. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of confusion and pain. Martin's accusations continued to rain down, more and more virulent. Thomas remained silent. His eyes moved from his mother to me, unable to take sides. I felt trapped, cornered. How had we got here? How had this day, which was supposed to be the most day of my life, turned into a nightmare? Sophie tried to defend me, to calm the situation, but her voice was lost in the din. My father remained by my side, protective hand on my shoulder. Finally Thomas spoke. His voice was cold, distant, so unlike the man I loved. "Emily, if you have taken this ring, return it at once, or the marriage will be annulled." The words hit me like a blow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The man I loved, the man who was going to be my husband in a few minutes, was now threatening me with a marriage on the basis of unfounded accusations. "Thomas," I begged. Tears streamed down my cheeks. "I swear I don't have the ring. I've never seen it. How can you doubt me?" But my words seemed to fall into thin air. Thomas's gaze was hard, affected by his mother's accusations, and perhaps by his own doubts. The guests began to get restless. I heard their murmurs, their speculations. Some took my side, others Martin's. The atmosphere of joy and love that should have prevailed that day had turned into one of suspicion and judgment. I felt alone, betrayed, humiliated. How could I prove my innocence? How could I convince Thomas the man I loved more than anything, that I had done nothing wrong? The minutes passed endlessly. Every second that passed seemed to drive it deeper. Between Thomas and me, I saw our future, all our dreams and plans crumbling before my eyes. Finally, I could no longer bear the situation. I made a decision. With all the dignity I could muster, I turned to Thomas. "If you can't trust me today," I said in a trembling but determined voice, "then maybe we shouldn't get married at all." A dead silence fell over the meeting. I saw the shock on Thomas's face, but I couldn't back down. I needed him to understand the gravity of the situation, to realize how much his suspicion was hurting me. Without waiting for his reaction, I turned to my father and Sophie. "Take me away from here," I whispered. As we walked towards the exit, I heard Thomas's voice calling my name, but I didn't turn around. My heart was in pieces, my faith shattered. What should have been the happiest day of my life had turned into my worst nightmare. As I left the church, I felt the sun on my face, a cruel contrast to the storm raging in my heart. I didn't know what the future held for me, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. I found myself in front of the St. Germain-des-Prés church, my heart in pieces and my mind in disarray. The June sun, which a few minutes earlier had seemed so promising a few minutes earlier, now seemed cruelly indifferent to my plight. Passers-by stared at me, fascinated by this bride, weeping on the steps of the church. I must have made a pitiful spectacle. Sophie took me by the shoulders and gently led me away from the entrance. My father, with a serious face, tried to disperse the curious, who were beginning to gather. I could still hear the echoes of the argument inside the church. Martin's shrill voice dominated all the others. "Come, Emily," Sophie whispered. "Let's go somewhere quieter." I let myself be led like an automaton to a small cafe a few steps away. The boss, seeing my condition, quickly seated us in a quiet corner out of sight. I collapsed into a chair. I could no longer hold back my sobs. How could he do this to me? I sobbed, my hands shaking. How could he doubt me? Sophie hugged me, whispering words of comfort that I didn't even hear. My father sat opposite me. His face showed suppressed anger. "My love," he said quietly, "we all know you've done nothing wrong. This woman is mad and Thomas is mad. Thomas should have defended you." His words, although they were comforting, they only increased the pain in my chest. Yes, Thomas should have defended me. He should have believed in me, in us. But he hadn't. Suddenly the door to the cafe burst open. Thomas stood there, out of breath, his eyes red. My heart leapt in my chest, a mixture of hope and fear. "Emily," he said as he approached our table, "we need to talk." My father jumped up and stood between Thomas and me. "I think you've done enough, boy," he growled. But I put my hand on my father's arm. I still needed to hear what Thomas had to say. Maybe he would apologize. Maybe he would finally believe me. "It's all right, Dad." "Dad," I said in a weak voice, "let him speak." Thomas approached hesitantly. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the struggle between his love for me and his duty to his family. "Emily," he began, "I'm sorry about what happened in the church. My mother, she's upset. That ring means a lot to her." I couldn't believe my ears. After everything that had just happened, he went on to justify his mother's actions. "And me, Thomas?" I asked. My voice trembled with anger and grief. "Don't I mean anything to you? How could you think I would steal anything?" Thomas looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know what to think, Emily. My mother is so sure of herself." It was too much. The pain in my chest turned to cold rage and I stood up. I faced the man I thought I knew, who I thought I loved. "Is your mother so sure of herself?" I repeated in disbelief. "And I? Thomas, are you not sure of me? Of my integrity? Of my love for you?" The people in the cafe were now staring at us, mesmerized by our drama unfolding before them. But I didn't care. All that mattered at that moment was Thomas and me, and the gulf that seemed to be growing between us. "Emily, try to understand," Thomas pleaded. This is a difficult situation for all of us. If you could just... I didn't let him finish. If I could, what, Thomas? Confess to a crime I didn't commit. I could not accept being treated like a thief on my wedding day. The tension was palpable. Sophie and my father were ready to intervene. I felt that the situation could degenerate at any moment. It was then that Thomas spoke the words that would change everything. Words I never thought I would hear from his lips. Maybe if you just confessed, we could work things out, he said. His voice barely audible. Time seemed to stand still. I stared at Thomas, searching his eyes for a trace of the man I loved, the man I trusted. But all I saw was a stranger. Without thinking, my hand left. The slap echoed through the cafe, startling the other customers. Thomas took a step back in shock. His cheek was flushed where my hand had struck him. "How dare you?" I cried. Tears streamed down my cheeks. "How dare you ask me to confess to something I haven't done?" The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas looked at me, a hand on his cheek. Disbelief was written all over his face. Then, in an instant, his expression changed. Surprise gave way to anger. Anger that I had never seen in him before. What happened next will forever be etched in my memory as the moment my world fell apart forever. Thomas raised his hand. I experienced the movement as if in slow motion, unable to react. Then pain exploded across my cheek. As his fist made contact with my face, I staggered backwards, barely caught by Sophie. The cries of surprise and outrage from the other customers in the cafe reached me. As if through a mist, my father lunged at Thomas and pinned him against the wall. "You bastard!" yelled my father, shaking Thomas like a plum tree. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" The owner of the cafe stepped in and separated the two men. "Get out! Get out of here before I call the police." Sophie was already leading me to the exit, protecting me from the curious and horrified looks from the other customers. My father followed us, giving Thomas one last murderous look before slamming the cafe door. Once outside, the reality of what had just happened hit me hard. The man I loved, the man I was going to marry, had just hit me. The shock, the pain, the betrayal, all mixed together in a whirlwind of emotions that I couldn't disentangle. "We need to go to hospital," Sophie said. She examined my cheek, which was starting to swell. But I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "I just want to go home." My father nodded. He understood my need to get away from this place, from these memories. He called a taxi, and soon we were driving through the streets of Paris. We left the church behind, the cafe, and the ruins of what should have been the happiest day of my life. The journey was in heavy silence. I looked out of the window without really seeing the passing landscape, the bustling streets of Paris, the crowded terraces of cafes, the couples holding hands. Everything seemed to belong to another world, a world I no longer belonged to. When we got home, Sophie helped me up the stairs. My legs were shaking and I felt drained of energy. Once in my flat, I went straight to the bathroom. I had to see for myself. The mirror reflected the image of a stranger, a woman with red eyes, smeared makeup. A bruise was already forming on her cheek. My wedding dress, a symbol of joy and hope, now seemed a cruel irony. I slowly took it off. I let the white fabric slide down to my feet. Every move reminded me of pain, both physical and emotional. Sophie knocked softly on the door. "Emily, do you need help?" "No," I replied in a voice I didn't recognize. "I just need to be alone for a while." I heard his footsteps leaving, and the murmur of his conversation with my father in the living room. They were worried about me. I knew it, but at that moment, I couldn't face their concern, their pity. I slipped into the shower. I let the hot water run over my body. The tears mixed with the water, and I finally gave my grief free rein. How did we get here? How could love turn so quickly into something so ugly, so painful? When I finally emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a bathrobe, I found Sophie and my father sitting in the living room. They jumped up when they saw me. Worry was written all over their faces. My dear, my father began. Perhaps we should lodge a complaint. But I shook my head. No, Dad. Not now, I can't. I can't face that right now. He nodded in understanding, despite the anger still in his eyes. Sophie came closer and gently took me in her arms. I'll stay with you tonight, she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, grateful for the idea of facing this night alone. Scared me more than I cared to admit. Lying in bed that night, I listened to the regular breathing of Sophie, sleeping on the sofa in the living room. Sleep eluded me. My mind kept replaying the events of the day. Thomas doubting his mother's accusation. The slap, the blow. Every memory was like a dagger in my heart. As the first began to filter through the curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't let that day define the rest of my life. I had been a victim. Yes, I had. But I refused to remain a victim. Somehow, I had to find the strength to move on, to rebuild my life. With this determination, finally I felt sleep overtake me. A restless sleep, populated by confused dreams but still asleep. And when I woke up, I would have to face a new day, a new reality. A reality where I was no longer the bride-to-be, but a woman betrayed, hurt but determined to rise again. The next morning, I was awakened by a ray of sunlight, filtering through the curtains. For a moment everything seemed normal. Then the searing pain in my cheek brought me back to reality. The events of the day before came flooding back to me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. I slowly sat up in my bed. Every movement seemed to require superhuman strength. My reflection in my dressing table mirror made me jump. A purple rim of spread across my left cheek, a cruel reminder of Thomas's betrayal. Sophie was still asleep on the living room sofa. I slipped quietly out of the room. I did not want to wake her. In the kitchen, I switched on the coffee machine. The familiar sound brought a semblance of normalcy to what was shaping up to be anything but a normal day. My phone, which I had turned off the day before, was taunting me on the counter. I knew I would have to turn it on at some point, face the outside world. But not now, not right away. The coffee flowed slowly. Its aroma filled the kitchen. I stared at the full cup. I tried to collect my thoughts. What was I going to do? How was I going to explain the situation to my family, my friends, my colleagues? Shame and anger welled up inside me, leaving me confused and exhausted. Emily? Sophie's sleepy voice snapped me out of my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, her hair disheveled, her face marked with worry. How are you feeling? I shrugged, unable to find words to describe the whirlwind of emotions inside me. Sophie came closer and enveloped me in a silent embrace. This simple gesture of affection brought back the tears I had been holding back. I've been here ever since I woke up, she whispered, gently rubbing my back. We'll get through this together. We stayed like that for a moment. The silence of the kitchen, broken only by the sound of the coffee machine. Finally, I slowly pulled away. I wiped my eyes. Thank you for staying, I said, trying to keep my voice from crying. Sophie gave me a sad smile. That's normal. That's what friends are for. Right, we were sitting at the kitchen table, each with a steaming cup of coffee. The silence stretched between us, comfortable, but full of unspoken words. Maybe you should see a doctor? Sophie suggested gently, pointing her chin at my cheek. I shook my head. I'll be fine. It's just a bruise. Sophie frowned in obvious disagreement, but didn't insist. She knew when not to push. What are you going to do now? She asked. After a moment, that was the million-dollar question. What was I going to do? My world had fallen apart in one day. The future I had imagined had evaporated like smoke. I don't know. I finally admitted. I'm going to have to cancel the honeymoon. Tell the guests the wedding is off. Face my family, my colleagues. The to-do list seemed endless and overwhelming. How would I explain what had happened? The truth seemed too cruel, too humiliating to share. You don't have to do everything at once, Sophie said. She put her hand on mine. Take all the time you need. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. But I knew I couldn't put off the inevitable forever. With a sigh, I reached for my phone. It was time to face reality. As soon as I turned it on, it started vibrating wildly. Dozens of notifications appeared. Missed calls, messages, emails. Most of them were from family and friends. I was worried that I had no messages. A few were from Thomas. My finger hovered over his name. Should I read his messages? What could he possibly have to say to me after what he had done? Before I could make up my mind, the phone started to ring. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered it. "Hello, Mom, Emily." My God, at last we were worried to death. What had happened? Where are you? My mother's questions poured out like a torrent. I closed my eyes, searching for the strength to answer. "I'm home, Mom," I said quietly. "I'm fine, it's just, the wedding is off." There was silence at the other end of the line. Then a hesitant voice. "Cancellation, but why? What happened? My darling?" I looked at Sophie, who nodded in encouragement. I took a deep breath. I began to recount the events of the previous day. The accusations from Thomas's mother. His lack of trust in me. The argument in the cafe. When I got to the moment when Thomas had hit me, my voice breaking, my mother's shocked gasp on the other end of the line made me realize how serious the situation was. "Oh, darling," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. "I'll be right there." Despite my protests, she insisted on coming. An hour later, she was at my door, her arms full of shopping bags. "I thought you might not want to go out," she explained, placing the bags on the kitchen counter. His gaze lingered on my face, and I saw his eyes filled with tears. Without a word, she took me in her arms. She held me like when I was little. The day passed in a blur of phone calls and visits. My father arrived shortly after my mother. Anger and worry battled over his face. My brothers called and offered to look after Thomas, an offer I firmly refused, despite a small voice inside me that found the idea tempting. Sophie stayed by my side, screening calls, managing visitors, making sure I ate and rested. His presence was a rock I clung to in the storm of my emotions. Towards the end of the afternoon, just as I was starting to feel overwhelmed by everything that was happening, my phone rang again. Thomas's name appeared on the screen. The room seemed to freeze. My parents and Sophie were looking at me. They were waiting for my reaction. My heart was racing as I stared at the screen, uncertain. "You don't have to answer," my father said quietly, but I knew I had to. If I wanted to move forward, I had to face this conversation. With a trembling hand, I replied, "Hello, Emily." Thomas's voice was hoarse, as if he had been crying. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." Stop, I interrupted, surprising even myself with the firmness of my voice. "You can't apologize for what you've done, Thomas." There was silence at the other end of the line. Then in a broken voice, I know I have ruined everything, but I need to see you. There's something you need to know." My heart leapt in my chest. What could he possibly have to say to me? Part of me wanted to hang up, to cut all ties. But another part, smaller but insistent, wanted answers. "I don't think this is a good idea," I finally said. "Please, Emily," he begged just once. "After that, if you never want to see me again, I'll understand." I closed my eyes, weighing the pros and cons. Curiosity finally won out. Okay, I gave in. But not today. And not alone. We agreed to meet the next day at a cafe near my house. Sophie insisted on coming with me, and I gratefully accepted. After hanging up, I turned to my family and Sophie. There was a mixture of concern and support on their faces. "Are you sure you want to see him?" my mother asked, her voice tinged with concern. I nodded. "I need to know. I need to understand why all this has happened." That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep. What could Thomas possibly have to say to me? What could possibly justify what had happened? As dawn began to break, I got up, resigned to a sleepless night. I made some coffee and sat on the balcony, and watched Paris slowly wake up. Whatever this day had in store for me, I knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same. But maybe, just maybe, I would find the answers I needed to start healing. The day of my meeting with Thomas dawned, gray and threatening. The Paris sky seemed to reflect my state of mind, heavy with unanswered questions and apprehension. I prepared myself mechanically, simply choosing comfortable clothes, far from the wedding dress I should have worn on our honeymoon. Sophie arrived early, her face full of worry and determination. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked me, for the umpteenth time. I nodded, unable to put into words the complex mix of emotions swirling inside me: fear, anger, curiosity, a remnant of love. Maybe everything was mixed up in an indescribable chaos. We made our way to the Café des Artistes, a small, quiet place where Thomas and I used to go. The choice of this place suddenly seemed cruel to me, full of happy memories that contrasted so painfully with the present reality. Thomas was already there when we arrived. He was sitting at a table in the back. His pale face betrayed his lack of sleep. When he saw us, he stood up awkwardly. He was clearly hesitating how to greet us. "Emily," he said quietly. His eyes lingered on my face, on the still visible mark of his beating. Guilt and shame were clearly visible in his eyes. "Thomas," I replied coldly. I sat down without offering him my hand. Sophie sat down next to me, her presence reassuring. A heavy silence fell. The waiter came to take our orders. A welcome distraction at last. Thomas took a deep breath. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I know I don't deserve you to listen to me. Get to the point." "Thomas," I interrupted. "You said you had something to say to me, so say it." He nodded. His hands played nervously with his coffee cup. After what happened in the church and in the cafe, I went home to my parents. I was lost, angry, confused. And then he stopped, as if searching for words. I felt my heart speed up, anticipating what would come next. "I found the ring," he finally blurted out. The world seemed to stop for a moment. What, I whispered in disbelief. "My grandmother's emerald ring," Thomas continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was in my mother's room. She had just misplaced it." I felt anger rise like a lost wave. I repeated. My voice trembled with suppressed rage. "She accused me of stealing, ruining our marriage. And all because she had misplaced her ring." Thomas looked down, unable to meet my gaze. "I'm so sorry. Emily, I should have believed you. I should have." "Yes, you should have," I exploded, drawing stares from the other customers. "But in that moment, I didn't care. You should have trusted me. You should have defended me instead. You had me." Words failed me. Memories of the blow resurfaced, reviving the pain and humiliation. Sophie put a reassuring hand on my arm. "Calm down, Emily," she whispered. Then she turned to Thomas. "And your mother? What did she say when you found the ring?" Thomas's face twisted into a grimace of shame. She refused to admit her mistake. She said that she had probably put it there and forgotten about it, but that Emily could have taken it and put it back. I couldn't believe my ears. Even in the face of evidence, this woman refused to admit what she had done wrong. "And you believed her?" I asked incredulously. Thomas shook his head vigorously. "No, of course not. I had a huge argument with her. I told her that her behavior was unacceptable, that she had ruined our marriage, our happiness." He paused. He ran a shaking hand through his hair. "I left her house. I haven't spoken to them since." A heavy silence settled over our table. I stared at my coffee cup. I tried to digest this new information. Part of me was relieved that the truth had come out, that my innocence had been proven. But another part of me remained hurt and angry. "For what?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you believe me in the first place?" Thomas looked up at me, his gaze filled with remorse. "I wish I had a good answer for you. Emily, the truth is that I was a coward. I always had trouble standing up to my mother. You know that. And that day, faced with I panicked. I should have trusted you. I should have remembered everything we had been through together, but I let the fear and doubt take over. His words echoed within me, bringing back memories of our past conversations, about his complicated relationship with his mother. How many times had I tried, encouraged him to stand up to her? How many times had I witnessed his discomfort at family dinners? That's no excuse. Thomas continued to interrupt my thoughts. Nothing can excuse what I did. To hit you, it's unforgivable. I will never forgive myself. I felt tears well up in my eyes. You're right, I said quietly. This is unforgivable. Thomas nodded, accepting my words. I know. I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness, Emily. I just wanted you to know the truth. You deserve at least that. We were silent for a moment, each of us lost in our thoughts. The coffee continued its activity around us. The conversations and the noise of the made a strange sound, a backdrop to our personal drama. What are you going to do now? Sophie asked. Thomas shrugged his shoulders. I don't really know. I took a leave of absence from work. I think I need to take a step back. Think about it all, maybe see a therapist. I don't ever want to be that man who put his hand on the woman he loved. His words touched me more than I wanted to admit. In spite of everything that had happened, a small part of me was relieved to see that he recognized the gravity of his actions. And you, Emily, he asked quietly, what are you going to do? I took a deep breath and realized that I had not really thought about that question. The last few days had been a whirlwind of emotions and reactions, leaving me briefly to think about the future. I don't know. I admit it. I suppose I will have to officially cancel the wedding, warn the guests, and then there is work. I don't know how to explain it all. I can help you, suggested Thomas, for the cancellations. I mean, to say the least. I hesitated for a moment before nodding my head in agreement. But I prefer it to be Sophie who does the mediation. I don't think I'm ready to have any more contact with you right now. Thomas nodded. I understand. Of course, I understand. As our meeting drew to a close, I felt strangely empty. The revelation of the truth should have given me a sense of satisfaction, of justice, but instead I just felt tired and sad for all that had been lost. We lifted ourselves up, the heavy atmosphere of unsaid and regret. As we left, Thomas made a gesture as if to touch me, but at the last moment he was happy. I'm really sorry, Emily, he said for the last time, for everything. I looked at him, this man I liked and thought I knew. Despite the pain and anger, I couldn't help but feel a little sorry for him. Goodbye, Thomas, I said simply before distracting myself. Sophie and I left the coffee, leaving behind not only Thomas, but also the shattered remains of what should have been, of our future together. As we walked through the streets of Paris, I felt my shoulders lifting. The truth was finally known. My name was cleared of all suspicion, but I knew the road to healing would be long. Broken trust, shattered dreams, physical and emotional pain. All this would take time to heal. For the first time since that fateful day in church, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps one day, I could look back and not see that event as the end of everything, but as the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The days following my meeting with Thomas passed through a fog of reflection and introspection. The revelation of the truth about the ring had brought a certain relief, but it had also opened the door to a myriad of questions about my future. Every morning I awoke with a feeling of emptiness, as if I was floating in a space between my old life and a new one I could not yet imagine. Sophie, true to her promise, took care of the logistics of the annulment. She called the guests, the caterer, the florist, spared me the pain of having to explain why the big day was not going to happen. I was eternally grateful to her. Even though each time she gave me a report, I felt my heart tighten a little more. One morning, as I sipped my coffee on the balcony of my apartment, I looked at Paris to wake up my vibraphone. It was a message from Thomas. I have started therapy. I know it doesn't change anything I've done, but I wanted you to know. Take care of yourself, Emily." I stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing how to react. Part of me was relieved that he was seeking help. I realized he was having problem solving. Another game remained suspicious, wondering if it was just an attempt to regain my sympathy. This message was the catalyst I needed to start to think seriously about my future. Until then, I had been in a kind of survival mode, dealing with day-to-day emergencies. But it was time to make some decisions. I decided to take a few days off to reflect. My boss was understanding of my situation, accepted without hesitation. "Take the time you need, Emily," he told me. "Your work will be there when you get back." The first day I went to the Luxembourg Gardens. It was a place where Thomas and I liked to walk, to discuss our projects for the future. Today, I went there alone, notebook in hand, determined to put my thoughts in order. I sat on a bench overlooking the large pool. I began to write. My feelings, my fears, my hopes. Everything poured out onto the paper in an uninterrupted flow. I realized how much I needed this moment. The catharsis of writing. One thing was clear. I couldn't go back. Even if Thomas complied with the therapy, even if he changed. The trust had been irreparably broken. The blow he had dealt me had left a much deeper mark, now almost erased on my cheek. The second day I met my mother for lunch. We sat down on the terrace of a small bistro. We took advantage of the spring sunshine. "How are you really, darling?" she asked. Her eyes searched my face with concern. I took a deep breath. "It's better. I think I am beginning to see more clearly." She nodded, encouraging me to continue. "I don't think I can forgive Thomas," I said slowly. "At least not now. Maybe never." My mother took my hand in hers. "It's normal, Emily. What he did is serious. You don't have to forgive him." His words comforted me more than I could have imagined. To have permission not to forgive. Not to try to save a relationship that had hurt me so much at any cost, was liberating. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. I thought for a moment before answering. "I think I need a change of air. Maybe take a sabbatical. Travel a bit." The idea had germinated in my head the day before, while I was distractedly through a travel magazine. The picture of a white beach in the Seychelles had made me dream of escape again. My mother smiles. "I think it's a great idea. You have to find yourself, to rebuild yourself, far away from everything." On the third day, I met Sophie in our favorite cafe. I told him about my thoughts, about my desire to leave. "I'm proud of you, Emily," she said, hugging me. "Take care of yourself. That's the most important thing." We spent the afternoon exploring possible destinations, dreaming of adventure and new horizons. For the first time in a long time, I was surprised to laugh, to project myself into the future with enthusiasm. On the fourth day, I returned to work. I had made my decision. In my boss's office, I took a deep inspiration before I spoke. I wanted to take sabbatical leave. I announced, "I need to take some time off to travel." My boss listened carefully. I nodded my head in understanding. "I think it's a wise decision." "Emily, how long will you be away?" 6 months, I replied, surprised at my own audacity. "If it is possible." Of course, to my surprise, he accepted without hesitation. "You are a valuable employee. Emily, take all the time you need. Your post will be waiting for you when you return." Relief and gratitude washed over me. That conversation marked the start of my new chapter. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. I finally chose the Seychelles as my first destination, with the idea of perhaps other countries afterwards. Sophie helped me plan my itinerary. She was as excited as if she were leaving. 1 week after my meeting with Thomas, I found myself in front of him again. This time it was me who asked to see him. We ended up in a park, a neutral country. "I am leaving," I told him. Without preamble, I took a sabbatical. "I'll be traveling for 6 months." Thomas looked at me, a glimmer of sadness in his eyes, but also understanding. "I understand," he said slowly. "You need this. I nodded yes. I need to meet to heal. A silence settled between us, responsible for unsaid and regret. I'm sorry, Emily, he said finally, for everything. I hope you can forgive me. I looked at him, this man I liked who I thought I knew. Despite the pain and anger that remained, I felt a form of peace invade me. Maybe one day, I said slowly, but not now. I have to think of myself. We parted with those words, a permanent page in our lives. The day of my departure came, quickly on the platform, ready to catch the train to the airport. I was surrounded by my family and Sophie. The farewells were emotional, but filled with hope and excitement. I will take care of you, my darling, my mother said as she took me in her arms. Make the most of it, but don't forget to keep us informed, my father added with a smile. Sophie was the last to embrace me. I will miss you so much, she whispered, but I'm so proud of you. As I boarded the train, my bag slung over my shoulder, I felt light for the first time in weeks. The future was uncertain, but it was mine. I had made my choice. I chose to focus on myself, on my healing and personal growth. The train began to slowly leave the station. I looked out the window. I saw Paris leaving. Part of me felt sad. I was leaving behind so many memories, good and bad. But another part of me was filled with hope and anticipation. I did not know what these 6 months would bring me. I didn't know who I would be when I returned. But I knew one thing. I had made the right decision. This adventure was the first step in my reconstruction towards a stronger, wiser Emily, ready to kiss life with a new look. As the landscape passed before my eyes, I took out my newspaper and began to write. Not about the past this time, but of the future. My hopes, my dreams, the things I wanted to achieve. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. Mistress of my destiny. New York, the journey was just beginning, and I was ready to welcome it with open arms. The sun of the seashells caressed my skin as I gently woke up, rocked by the sound of the waves. It had been a month since I had left Paris for a month, leaving behind a life which now seemed to belong to someone else. Every morning I opened my eyes to this earthly paradise. I felt a little lighter, a little more myself. The first few days had been difficult. Despite the breathtaking beauty of the island, I felt lost, disoriented. The jet lag was just an excuse to hide the real gap I felt. The gap I felt between the life I had imagined and the one I was now living. But little by little, I began to open up to this new reality. I spent my days exploring the island, getting lost in its lush forests, swimming in the crystal clear waters, sitting on the beach every evening, watching the sun on the Indian Ocean. Its extravagant colors seemed to take away a little more of my pain. It was on one of these evenings that I met Luc, a French photographer who has traveled the world for years. For years, we had started to talk, sharing our travel experiences and stories. Without really realizing it, I surprised myself by telling him my story, that of the marriage that had not taken place, betrayal, violence. Luc had listened to me without judgment, simply offered a listening ear and a shoulder to cry on. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt waiting for my shoulders to lift, to talk to a stranger, someone who did not know Thomas or my life in Paris. Had a cathartic effect that I had not anticipated. In the days that followed, Luc and I continued to see each other. He had introduced me to photography and taught me how to capture the beauty of the island through my lens. I had found a new passion, a way to express my feelings without the need for words. One evening, as we were sorting through the day's photos, Luc looked at me with an enigmatic smile. You know, Emily, he said, I think you should consider extending your trip. I laughed. I thought he was joking, but his look was serious. I'm serious, he continued. I have a friend who runs a dive center in Thailand. He is looking for someone to help him with administration and communication. This could be a great opportunity for you. The idea seemed crazy at first. Me in Thailand, working in a dive center. It was light years away from my life in Paris, my work in finance, but the more I thought about it, the more the idea took hold. Wasn't this exactly what I needed? A chance to completely reinvent myself, away from everything that reminded me of my old life. After several days of thinking and long conversations with Sophie on Skype, I made my decision. I was going to do it. I was going to extend my sabbatical leave and go to Thailand. The day of my departure from the Seychelles was both sad and exciting. I said goodbye to Luke, thanking him for his friendship and for opening my eyes to new possibilities. He made me promise to send him pictures of my adventures in Thailand. Arriving in Bangkok was a culture shock. Spicy smells, constant noise, humid heat. Everything was so different to what I knew. But strangely, I felt at home in this organized chaos. The dive center was on a small island in the south of Thailand. As soon as I arrived, I was greeted by Mark, Luke's friend, French expatriate for over 10 years. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I surprised myself by smiled more than I had for months. The first few weeks were intense. I learned the basics of diving while taking care of the administration of the center. It was a demanding but rewarding job. Every evening, exhausted but satisfied, I fell asleep to the sound of the waves. It was a feeling of peace that I was beginning to like. One day I was working on the center's website. Mark came to me with an unexpected proposal. "Emily," he said, "I saw the photos you took. They are really good. Would you like to use them for our new brochure?" I was surprised and flattered. Luke's lessons had borne fruit, but I never thought my photos could be used professionally. It was the beginning of a new adventure. In addition to my administrative work, I started documenting the life of the dive center. I photographed divers, colorful fish, coral reefs. Each shot reminded me of how beautiful and surprising life can be. The months passed, and I realized that I did not want to go back to Paris. My life here was simple but fulfilling. I was fulfilled in ways I had never imagined. One evening I was sitting on the beach watching the sunset. I took out my mobile phone and dialed the number of my former boss in Paris. "Hello, Jean-Pierre," I said when he picked up. "I hope you don't mind." "Emily, what a pleasure to hear from you. How is your trip going?" I took a deep breath. "That's what I wanted to tell you. I don't think I'll be coming back to Paris." There was a moment of silence at the other end of the line. "End of the line. I see," he said finally. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied, surprised at my own certainty. "I have found something here. A life that suits me. I know it's unexpected. But Emily," he interrupted me gently, "you don't have to justify yourself. I am happy for you. You deserve that happiness." His words touched me deeply. After hanging up, I stayed long looking at the ocean, reflecting on the path I had traveled. The next day, I called my family and Sophie to tell them of my decision. They were surprised. Of course they were, but also incredibly understanding and supportive. "You look happy, darling," said my mom. "That's all that matters to us." Sophie, true to form, she was already planning her visit. "You still think I won't let you live this dream alone?" To live this dream alone, she joked. The weeks that followed were full of changes. I found a little bungalow near the beach. I began to learn the Thai and invested even more in my work. At the diving center, one evening, I was sorting through my photos from the day. I came across an old picture of me and Thomas. I was surprised to see that the pain I expected to feel was absent. Instead, I felt a sweet melancholy, almost gratitude. Without this painful experience, I would never have had the courage to leave everything behind, to really discover myself. I took my newspaper and began to write, as I had done every night since I left Paris. But this time, instead of writing about the past, I wrote about the future, about my project to develop my photographic skills, about my desire to explore other islands in the region, about the peace I had found here. By closing my newspaper, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was really happy. Not in a brilliant and loud way, but in a deep and serene way. The journey had been long and difficult, but I had finally found my place. Here, on this small Thai island, I had found much more than a new beginning. I had found a new Emily, stronger, wiser, ready to kiss life in all its complexity. As I fell asleep that night, rocked by the sound of the waves, I smiled. Tomorrow would be another day, full of new adventures, new challenges, and I was ready to face them one photo at a time.